Hit talk, it'll be hot.
I'm a veteran.
Talk, it'll be red. It'll be hot.
I'm a business guy. I kind of like to start things on time. There's two times around here. There's real time and there's legislative time. I don't like legislative time. So we're going to try and do things on a real world basis. So this morning, with this, the Subcommittee of National Security, Illicit Finance, International Financial Institutions will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Follow the Money, the CCP's business model fueling the fentanyl crisis. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, I will yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. As every member of this committee is painfully aware, fentanyl is a poison that is afflicting every community in this country. This poison is a synthetic opioid, 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. Just 2 milligrams, equal to 10 to 15 grains of salt, is enough to be lethal. As a current DEA administrator, Ann Milgram has said, fentanyl, and I quote, is the single deadliest drug threat to our nation and threat that our nation has ever encountered, end quote. I share her assessment, which is why I chose to address it in our subcommittee's first hearing this Congress. In preparation for today's hearing, I consulted local law enforcement officials in Missouri who painted a grave picture. In 2021, synthetic opioids such as fentanyl took the lives of 1,374 Missourians. Despite all the facts, surprisingly, fentanyl remains a Schedule II narcotic, which is why I recently reintroduced the Stop Illicit Fentanyl Trafficking, or SIFT Act, to combat the skyrocketing amount of fentanyl-related deaths. Fentanyl trafficking has become synonymous with the Mexican cartels, who have exploited the Biden administration's lax enforcement of border security and immigration controls to pour this poison into our country. However, it is also vital that Americans understand the essential role that China plays in the fentanyl crisis. China is the primary source of the know-how and illicit materials that Mexican cartels use to manufacture lethal synthetic opioids. Moreover, despite the Chinese Communist Party's publicity, professed policy against the export of dangerous drugs for illicit use, the CCP supports the Chinese companies that export fentanyl precursors by offering them government benefits and preferential tax policies as generous as 10 to 13% rebates. Precursor chemicals from China are converted into powdered fentanyl in Mexico, which is then smuggled across the U.S. border to be pressed into brightly colored pills designed to look like legitimate prescription drugs to appeal to kids, referred to by the DEA as rainbow fentanyl. And no, this is not hyperbole. In August of 2022, the DEA released a statement entitled, "DEA Warns of Brightly Colored Fentanyl Use to Target Young Americans." When a pill that costs 13 cents to make can be sold for $10, the cartels are making huge profits, which, like illicit gains, must be laundered. Chinese professional money launderers have become adept at using underground banking schemes and networks of human assets to move illicit profits through the financial systems, commingling drug proceeds with remittances to China, and transferring funds to China using Chinese mobile banking apps. Given the gravity and scale of the situation, it is unclear why the Justice Department's top priority isn't to stop this reverse opium war that China is perpetrating against us. While there are a lot of pieces to this enormous challenge, including our unsecured border, the flow of money is the lifeblood of fentanyl trafficking, and where our committee can bring our experience and our expertise to bear. Our witnesses today will help us understand the fentanyl flows that sustain this deadly trade and what we can do to ensure that our government has the authorities, capabilities, and most importantly, the will to stop them. With that, let me yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses. Today, as you know, we are here to discuss the financial infrastructure that underlies the productions and proceeds of illicit fentanyl, a drug that is devastating to our communities and taking too many American lives. Not only does the scale of this epidemic nationwide concern me, but this is a matter concerning to me because of the huge impact in my home state of Ohio. CDC data shows that Ohio ranks in the top 4 highest drug overdose mortality rates in the country, and fentanyl-related substances make up nearly 80% of overdose deaths. Also, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, and I'm sure we'll hear from our witnesses, the growing number of children who have lost their lives to this. Over the last decade, fentanyl overdose deaths have rapidly grown as traffickers begin mixing illicit fentanyl with other drugs like heroin, cocaine, and controlled prescription drugs. In too many instances, those taking the substance have no idea that fentanyl has been added, resulting in countless deaths. Studies show that fentanyl is now the #1 cause of deaths for Americans between the ages of 18 and 45, taking the lives of more than 70,000 Americans each year. Furthermore, synthetic drug overdoses disproportionately affects communities of color, with deaths rising rates significantly for Blacks, Latinos, and indigenous people compared to their white counterparts. So let's follow the money and the stem flow of this illicit, deadly drug in our country. Following the money takes us to the origins of the supply chain in the People's Republic of China, the primary source of synthetic drugs and their precursors. Over the last decade, while claiming to cooperate with the United States, China has been overly permissive in allowing its drug traffickers and chemical producers to thrive. So I believe if we are going to save American lives, we need a global strategy to bolster anti-money laundering efforts to detect and disrupt finance streams wherever we can. We also need to shore up our efforts right here at home. And so we're hoping from our experts and members on this committee that we can do just that. But let me just say, I am very concerned that we have proposed budget cuts to certain departments at Treasury. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm asking all members on both sides to take a look at that. So, for example, we have proposed budget cuts to certain departments in Treasury, including FinCEN and OFAC, the very offices charged with protecting our financial systems. And as ranking member on this committee and keeping this germane to the financial systems, I think it's quite appropriate for us to ask that we look at that, because while they're protecting our financial systems from drug trafficking and other bad actors, why would we then defund the offices that we so badly need to assist us? And if we're really serious about cutting off illicit fentanyl and hitting back at the cartels, then it's critical that President Biden's budget be fully funded. I've read the testimonies from our witnesses here, and many of them have specifically said to us, what is it that you're doing? Why aren't you doing this? Where is the oversight? Why aren't you looking at whether it's social media, whether it is government, but they are putting the onus back on us. And we are ready to respond to that. And this is one of the things, Mr. Chairman, that I have that I think we should take a look at. Because a problem of this scale requires a multi-pronged, bipartisan, coordinated solution. And I really look forward to starting that process here today. And I thank our witnesses for lending all of your knowledge and expertise. And let me just say, I want to thank you for this book, John, and giving it to all of us. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you for those remarks, Ms. Beatty, and welcome to our panelists, our testimony today. What we'll do is introduce each of you, and then we'll open it up for your opening testimony. Today, we welcome the testimony of Mr. John Casera. Mr. Casera is an expert in the field of anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism. He's a former U.S. intelligence officer, Treasury special agent, and an accomplished author with several publications on financial crime and illicit finance. And I, too, want to thank you for providing your book to each one of us. It's going to be very instrumental, I think, in understanding and continuing to learn about this issue. So we certainly appreciate that and your expertise, sir. Mr. Donald M. Is our next witness. Mr. M. is a retired Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA agent, who has dedicated his career to combating drug trafficking and drug-related crimes. With over 25 years' experience, Mr. M. has led and participated in numerous high-profile investigations, including those involving international drug trafficking organizations. He has also worked in various roles within DEA's Special Operations Division, including as a special agent, assistant special agent in charge, and country attaché. Next, we have Professor Selena Realgo. Hope I got that right. We'll work at it here, Professor, sorry. The professor is an accomplished scholar and practitioner in the field of international security and development. She has held senior positions in both the public and private sectors, including serving as a career diplomat for the U.S. Department of State and as a senior executive for global financial institutions. Next, we have Mr. Jason Grellner. Mr. Grellner actually was a former constituent of mine and worked with him many, many years. He's been on the ground fighting this war in the trenches for years. Mr. Grellner is a highly experienced law enforcement professional with over 30 years of service in the field of criminal justice. He is a former narcotics detective and sheriff's deputy. Mr. Grellner has served in various roles within the Missouri State Narcotics Officers Association as a nationally recognized expert on drug policy. And next we have Ms. Gretchen Peters. Ms. Peters is a distinguished investigative journalist and author who has devoted her career to covering global security issues, including terrorism, organized crime, and corruption. Ms. Peters is currently the founder and executive director of the Alliance to Counter Crime Online, a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating online crime. Welcome to each of you. Thank you for taking time to be with us. We look forward to your testimony. Each one will be recognized for 5 minutes when we get ready to go here. And without objection, each of your written statements will be made a part of the record. Just as a housekeeping issue, the microphones that you have are not very sensitive. I can scream into this thing from way back at the wall back here and we'll be able to hear. But what you all need to do is pull those microphone boxes to you. They move, they're not stationary. And act like you're going to take a bite out of that microphone so that the stockifer on the end can hear you. If she gives me the thumbs down, that means we got to move people close to the microphones, okay? Well, thank you for your willingness to be here. And with that, Mr. Casera, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning. Chairman Luetkemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, Chairman McHenry, Ranking Member Waters, distinguished members of the subcommittee, it is an honor for me to testify in today's hearing. I would like to give you a general overview of the CCP's business model that is fueling the fentanyl crisis. Communist China is an ideological, military, economic, commercial, high-tech, intelligence, and diplomatic rival of the U.S. in the West. The People's Republic of China has a growing exploitative presence in the developing world. While these threats are known, Chinese Communist Party's involvement with transnational crime and money laundering is not. We have been ignoring the massive totality of what I call CCP Inc.'s involvement in transnational crime, as well as Chinese-centric money laundering methodologies and enablers that facilitate the criminality. My most recent book is China, Specified Unlawful Activities, CCP Inc., Transnational Crime, and Money Laundering. I found that criminal activity has seemingly become part of the CCP's overall strategy to grow its powers. We cannot look at the fentanyl issue in a vacuum or as an isolated concern. The CCP's business model that fuels the fentanyl crisis is also active in many other sectors of crime. In my book, I examine 12 significant categories of transnational crime. Each are also specified unlawful activities, also known as SUAs, or predicate offenses to charge money laundering. CCP's involvement in these crimes is approximately $2 trillion a year. To put things in perspective, $2 trillion is approximately half of the roughly $4 trillion that's laundered annually around the world. Regarding fentanyl, Chinese companies make chemical compounds sold globally for legitimate purposes in medicine and industrial processes. Opioid vendors shield themselves behind these companies and layers of interlinked companies, sometimes in related fields such as biotechnology. Illicit production and distribution are assisted by layer upon layer of traders and brokers and freight forwarders. Chinese trafficking organizations deliberately misuse this labyrinth to transport drugs, precursors, and contraband through shipping containers that are often mislabeled. Because of a few crackdowns by the authorities, the Chinese vendors created new distribution strategies. They sell precursor chemicals to foreign clients. Boutique suppliers also tweak their formulas, taking advantage of regulatory and enforcement loopholes. New transport and mail routes were developed, sending the banned substances into Mexico and sometimes to other countries. The U.S. is the final destination for most of the finished product. Also troubling is that Chinese actors aggressively use the internet and social media to advertise and market their illicit products, often in English. They blatantly target Western consumers. It's important to remember that the PRC is a command state. The CCP could easily block websites advertising fentanyl and other dangerous and illegal drugs. They choose not to. In my book, I discuss a number of money laundering methodologies and enablers used by the CCP, including underground banking, capital flight, gambling, real estate, and the use of offshores and secrecy jurisdictions. Corruption is the great enabler for money laundering. CCP Inc. has taken their domestic corruption and exported it overseas. CCP Inc. also excels at elite capture and influence operations. Other enablers I discuss in my book include Chinese organized crime, espionage, social monitoring, the promotion of Chinese control of international free trade zones, lack of Chinese cooperation with international law enforcement, and poor Chinese money laundering compliance. 3 money laundering techniques that directly impact the trafficking of fentanyl are trade-based money laundering, black market exchanges, and Fai Qian, or flying money. I provide explanations for each in my written testimony. Once again, these SUAs, methodologies, and enablers cannot be viewed in isolation. Rather, they are intertwined and must be addressed collectively. CCP Inc. international law breaking makes them exposed. They're vulnerable. I conclude with recommendations that emphasize law enforcement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kucera. Well done. Mr. Im, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Lukemar, Ranking Member Beatty, Chairman McHenry, and Ranking Member Waters, and distinguished members. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you here long today with my fellow panelists. Over the past 6 years, over 1/2 million Americans have died due to drug overdoses and poisonings, perpetuated predominantly by Sinaloa and CJ&G cartels, using synthetically produced chemicals designed and manufactured by Chinese chemists in laboratories located in Wuhan, Hubei province, and other provinces throughout China. As a recently retired DEA special agent, I spent over 31 years helping dismantle drug, weapon, wildlife trafficking, and terrorist organizations by following their money, then finding ways to cut off their wealth, their financial support mechanisms. In the early 1990s, with the FBI, Customs, IRS, the intelligence community, Department of Defense, State and Treasury departments, the DEA was a tip of the spear that led to the successful dismantling of the Medellin cartel, Pablo Escobar, and the Cali cartel. Not long after Escobar's accountants, lawyers were identified and removed, he met his fate in late 1993. In 1995, then President Clinton signed the first ever narcotic sanctionings against the Cali cartel under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that helped dismantle the once powerful cartel. The DEA had identified the cartel's entire front companies based on a series of financial raids conducted by the Colombian National Police years prior. By identifying and attacking the financial underpinnings of these criminal organizations, the DEA and its interagency partners were able to move upstream to the command and control, and subsequently to the kingpins and bring them to justice. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the DEA seized billions of dollars of drug cash off the streets, thereby disrupting the cartel's funding streams necessary to produce more drugs, acquire more weapons, and corrupt the rule of law. I ask you, Congress, the President of the United States, the national security leaders, the Secretaries of the Treasury, State Department, and Defense to fully support the DEA with a more robust budget, resources, and the authority to lead the whole U.S. government and let DEA be that tip of the spear again. Unleash the DEA. Let the men and women of the DEA do its job. Go after the cartels, the global Chinese money launderers, the cartel facilitators, their accountants, lawyers, businessmen and women, propping up and protecting their wealth that allows them to corrupt the rule of law with their profits. If you want to mitigate this deadly epidemic and curtail the poisonings and overdoses, give the DEA additional manpower by deputizing thousands of state, local, and federal law enforcement officers and agents, OPCON to the DEA field offices. Increase HIDTA budgets throughout the United States in order to identify online drug traffickers and coordinate efforts to conduct nationwide takedowns of digital drug dealers marketing and selling fentanyl-laced pills and other drugs and charge them with attempted murder. Let the prosecutors use the full force of the law so that law enforcement can capture and dismantle those higher-level sources of supply across the supply chain and throughout the United States and abroad. After the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the National Counterterrorism Center was created to coordinate intelligence, military, and law enforcement agencies in one facility to help track, destroy terrorist organizations, and prevent further attacks, with billions of dollars appropriated to fund and operate this center. Since 1992, the DEA has operated a similar entity called the Special Operations Division, an interagency center with over 35 law enforcement, intelligence, and military agencies, designed to identify the command and control of the most powerful, violent drug trafficking and transnational criminal organizations. The SOD successfully coordinated the arrest of drug cartel leaders like Chapo Guzman, helped arrest and remove key Taliban leaders off the battlefield, arrested key Hezbollah operators and financiers, and even a Russian arms dealer. Fuel the SOD with a larger budget and fully staff it with key interagency executives, agents, analysts, and allow the center to fully maximize its capabilities. Streamline a multi-pronged strategy in the SOD by integrating a team of criminal investigators, intelligence, cyber, and data analysts from the FBI, DEA, HSI, IRS, Treasury, and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service to establish a multi-agency financial investigation center that will identify the key financiers, the nodes of the entire illicit narcotic supply chain. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to realign and tune up our capabilities and provide the necessary resources and leadership to unleash the DEA and its interagency partners to dramatically reduce and eliminate this crisis once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. M. Professor Reallo, you are ready to go. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Luthmeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, and members of the committee for this opportunity to speak today on China and the Mexican cartel's asymmetrical war through the illicit fentanyl trade. Exactly 3 years ago, I had the privilege of appearing before this committee to discuss countering the threat from Mexican cartels and the opioid epidemic. Unfortunately, this epidemic has only worsened since then. During the pandemic, fentanyl use and trafficking exploded, and fentanyl has become the leading cause of death of Americans ages 18 to 49. The fentanyl crisis is not only a problem for the US, Canada, and Mexico, but has increasingly been discovered in Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Panama. Mexico's Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels and their Chinese suppliers and money runners have capitalized on the fentanyl crisis to empower and enrich themselves. They are waging an asymmetrical war against the US through this drug trade that is poisoning witting and unwitting Americans and exhausting vast public and private sector resources in prevention, treatment, and supply interdiction efforts. In classical asymmetrical warfare, the resources of adversaries are uneven, and those adversaries will attempt to exploit each other's relative weaknesses to gain advantage. In this case, the Mexican cartels and China are exploiting America's insatiable appetite for illicit drugs and our porous borders. China is the principal source of illicit fentanyl and fentanyl-related compounds and are manufactured and then shipped in bulk to the US and Mexico. When drug consumption here in the US shifted from cocaine and heroin to synthetics, and the US Postal Service clamped down on direct mail fentanyl shipments from China to the US, the Mexican cartels filled that vacuum and became primary traffickers of fentanyl and fentanyl-laced drugs that are easier to produce, they're more lucrative, and they're much more addictive. This China-Mexico connection grew when Chinese traffickers increased fentanyl precursor sales to the Mexican cartels. And in Mexico, we see that Chinese nationals, like the Zeng cartel, have become more involved in fentanyl operations, leveraging their extensive relationships with suppliers to support Mexican drug production. In 2018, President Trump urged President Xi of China to stop fueling the opioid crisis and managed to get the Chinese to designate all variants of fentanyl as controlled substances. Unfortunately, they have not been enforcing these controls and are actually encouraging, as the chairman noted, and incentivizing this industry. Nothing happens in China without the precise knowledge, permission, and sanction of the Communist Chinese Party. Last year, we actually saw the PRC punish the United States by suspending counter-narcotics operations when former Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan unexpectedly. Mexican cartels are increasingly turning to Chinese money launderers because they're much more efficient. They're more inexpensive and they're reliable. And we also know that the Chinese elite are desperately in need of hard US dollars. The Chinese serve as key enablers of the Mexican drug trafficking organizations. They profit at the front end of the business cycle, purveying fentanyl and precursor chemicals, and at the back end by laundering the millions of dollars generated by the Mexican cartels in the US. Unfortunately, the US is currently facing formidable challenges in combating the fentanyl crisis, as counter-narcotics cooperation with the PRC and Mexico are at a low point. This is a consequence of broader deteriorating relationships between our president and the Chinese President Xi and Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who do not consider fentanyl crisis their problem. But let's consider some measures to counter the illicit fentanyl crisis and the asymmetrical war that's being waged by the Chinese and Mexican cartels. First, decrease drug demand in the United States by educating Americans of the opioid epidemic and the deadly dangers from fentanyl-laced counterfeit drugs. Second, reinforce US border security to detect, interdict, and prevent the flow of drugs, including fentanyl, into the US. Third, designate the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. This would allow US government agencies to more aggressively pursue the cartels, their assets, and their collaborators under the Material Support to Terrorists statute. We did this 20 years ago with the Colombian FARC rebels, and it was quite effective. Fourth, hold China accountable for the export of fentanyl and precursor chemicals through punitive measures, including sanctions, tariffs, and perhaps threatening to withdraw most favored nation status. Fifth, revitalize US-Mexican security cooperation through the bicentennial framework to protect our peoples, pursue criminal networks, and disrupt those illicit financiers. And lastly, of particular interest to this committee, detect, dismantle, and prosecute Mexican and Chinese money laundering networks associated with the fentanyl crisis in the US and abroad. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor. And Mr. Grellner, you're up next for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Luetkemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, esteemed members of the committee. Thank you all for allowing me to testify today regarding the poisoning of nearly 1 million Americans. Opioids and now synthetic opioid poisoning is the leading cause of accidental death in the United States, overtaking car accidents nearly a decade ago. But this is no accident. Drug trafficking organizations know exactly what the impact on individuals and communities will be, and the overall trend has the hallmarks of a planned attack on the United States by terrorist organizations, narco states, and world powers bent on destabilizing and weakening the United States. Drug abuse in the United States has always had an element of one person's greed preying on another person's illness, with yet another person getting rich off the ill-gotten gains. This attack will not be stopped by merely attempting to treat the sick in our own country or by fighting this threat from inside our own borders. This overwhelming international push of deadly poison into our communities is an immediate threat to our national security and deserves an immediate, commensurate response. It is anticipated that statistics may show another 140,000 Americans died from fentanyl or one of its many synthetic derivatives in 2022. That will be on top of the 107,000 Americans who were killed in 2021. Synthetic fentanyl, as you have heard, is largely manufactured in Mexico from ingredients sourced in China. Chinese companies have been supplying the United States with cheap synthetic drugs across the internet for the past 20 years. Illicit manufacturers circumvent DEA and FDA regulations by changing the chemical makeup just enough to offer a slightly different experience to the user while getting around federal law. It should come as no surprise that when China cracked down on synthetic fentanyl distribution, it made no difference in worldwide synthetic opioid sales. Chinese organized crime, under the watchful eye of the CCP, began selling the components instead of the final product. Both the Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels immediately began manufacturing the poison in multi-kilo batches within days. Cartels easily buy kilos of precursor chemicals from China-linked middlemen and now operate with impunity at Western Mexican ports to ensure quick delivery. A kilo of Chinese precursors may cost as little as $200, but can be sold in New York for $3 to $5 for only 2 milligrams. The profit on that kilo can reach $1 million. That money is used to pay dealers, mules, stash houses, security, bribes, money laundering, and to buy power and influence. The recent conviction of Genaro Garcia Luna, Mexico's former public safety secretary, shows the height of influence the cartels wield in Mexico. The question that always comes to my mind when a Mexican official is indicted in the U.S. is why? If there was enough evidence to charge and convict in the U.S., why is the Mexican government not engaged in seeking justice on their own? Mexico is a narco state open for business with any foreign power or terrorist organization willing to pay for their political influence and the cost of dealing with U.S. border controls. With an estimated $60 billion a year illicit drug industry thriving on our southern border, no single solution will end this problem, which has been brewing since the 1800s. In February of this year, 128,777 individuals were caught crossing the U.S.-Mexican border. Of those, 16 were on the FBI terrorist watch list. 16 watch-listed individuals in 1 month, and those were just the people who were caught. Mexico and China do not have the best interests of the United States or the citizens in mind. Let's put this in perspective. If a foreign country had infiltrated the United States with terrorist agents, released ricin or anthrax that killed over 100,000 Americans in a single year, what would our response be? There's no single silver bullet solution to this problem. Just as in any confrontation, the winner is the entity that attacks from as many angles as possible. Federal policy has trended towards addressing the demand side of the equation over the past decade as the epidemic has skyrocketed. The data and empirical evidence clearly show that this approach is not working, and we will never rehabilitate our way out of this. Just as with COVID, we didn't just wait for people to get sick and treat the ill. We pushed for a vaccine to prevent the virus from taking hold. We need strong prevention efforts in our schools and community organizations. We need renewed commitment to funding state, local, and federal task forces, which are the most potent tools we have in addressing drug trafficking networks. State and federal funding for task forces has declined in the recent years, just as drug trafficking and overdose has skyrocketed. In closing, I want to thank the committee for examining this important topic that's killing hundreds of individuals daily across the nation. We must not accept another child dying in a school bathroom, or a loved one on the street, or in the home of from drug poisoning. We must do more, and the time to act was yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grellner. Ms. Peters, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lukemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, distinguished members of the subcommittee. This is my 4th time since 2019 testifying in Congress about the deadly fentanyl crisis and how social media drives it. And I have to say, I am angry about and tired of coming here to discuss this. Why are we still sitting here talking while so many Americans, and especially so many young Americans, are dying? Since my first testimony in 2019, our country has lost hundreds of thousands of people to fentanyl. Among them pictured here, we've lost Alexander Neville, Jessica Filson, Daniel Puerta, whose father is sitting here today with us, Giovanni Perkins, Private Tyler Duncan, Devin Noring, and so many more that I submitted a memorial gallery along with my testimony. It is almost 50 pages long, and it represents a fraction of the number of people who've died. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Alliance to Counter Crime Online. We are a team of researchers, NGOs, and citizen investigators who have come together to fight the deadly surge in serious crime activity that is taking place on surface web platforms. Our alliance has supported our members, tech whistleblowers, and victims of online crime to file civil complaints against tech platforms, and we do a lot of research on what's happening in various types of organized crime. Jaime Puerta, for example, is part of a group of families that are suing Snapchat, where his son and other children connected with dealers to purchase the pills that killed them. I applaud you for the fact that you are aiming to target Chinese companies that are facilitating the spread of deadly fentanyl analogs in this country. But I want to know, I'm here to ask you today, why aren't you also targeting the American social media companies whose algorithms spread these deadly pills that are killing so many of our children? Brick and mortar businesses operate under a duty of care to keep illegal activity off their premises. If a nightclub becomes a haven for drug dealing, it can face fines and even closures. Yet social media platforms like Instagram and Snapchat, which are used by a vast majority of American teens, are riddled with drug content. Slide 2. I've submitted for the record typical screenshots that show drug dealers operating on Snapchat and Instagram. The ones pictured here have account names like Buy Oxycontin Chicago, Place Your Order, pictures of pills and powder, and the emojis that are widely used to represent drug sales. In other words, these accounts are out in the open, easy to find, and unambiguous about their purpose. But because of Section 230 of the Communications Act, this content is considered free speech, protected free speech. Distinguished committee members, this content does not represent somebody expressing their protected right to free speech. It represents people committing felonies. And I want to know how many more young Americans have to be sacrificed on the altar of free speech before you, our elected members, can figure out a way to define the difference between protected speech and criminal conduct, which is what we're seeing here. I'm submitting for the record a briefing that the Department of Justice asked our Alliance to Counter Crime Online to explain how we think our laws can be adjusted to govern cyberspace better and to address organized crime activity on the surface web. I'm also submitting a briefing paper explaining the toxic mix of circumstances driving the unprecedented number of drug-related deaths in our country. You asked us to follow the money, and this is another area where we believe that social media platforms ought to be regulated differently from brick and mortar financial institutions. A number of big platforms where fentanyl and other counterfeit medicines are moving have built-in payment processing systems that function much like PayPal or Western Union. These payment systems are usually separately registered subsidiaries, registered money service businesses that are wholly owned by the parent company. 3 types of criminal activity are happening through these payment platforms. They include the retail sales, like you see here. Next slide, please. The wholesale sale of drugs from producers and chemical companies like pictured here, mainly in China, selling precursors to wholesalers here in the United States. From the research we have done at ACCO, it's apparent that most platforms are technically compliant with Know Your Customer regulations, yet the regulations don't anticipate where the parent company is the owner of a money service provider and a massive data aggregator, or individuals that aggregates data on individuals. For example, Meta owning both Meta Pay and Facebook Marketplace, or Tencent owning the payment platform that is connected to WeChat. In other words, the moderators tracking payments can't see if drug content, and moderators watching the content have no way to alert the payment moderators that there's a drug transaction happening. What this means is that the tech companies are actually making millions of dollars off of the drug trade in this country. We're asking you today to commission a congressional investigation and to subpoena tech companies, including Meta and Tencent, to investigate how they moderate payments and how much they earn off of illegal drug sales. My final point, I also ask you to investigate whether the scale of drug activity on social media platforms, specifically Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, and WeChat, rises to the level of RICO violations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Peters. We've been joined by the chairman and ranking member of the full committee. The chairman has waived his opening statement, so he will be asking questions later, but the ranking member, Ms. Waters from California, has requested a minute, so she's recognized at this point for a statement for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lukemeyer. I do have a question that I would like to raise at this point. Let me first thank. Okay, all right, then we'll do the opening statement. The trafficking of fentanyl and other drugs poses a significant public concern all across the United States. In Los Angeles County alone, the number of deaths tied to fentanyl overdoses has skyrocketed, with more than 13 times as many deaths in 2021 as there were 5 years prior. Unfortunately, Black and brown communities are all too familiar with the effects of drug epidemics on their communities. And I hope that the same attention being paid to communities harmed by fentanyl will be paid to the communities hit by other drug epidemics, including crack cocaine. I also hope that this committee rejects efforts by extreme Republicans in Congress bent on slashing the budgets of the Treasury Department agencies like FinCEN and OFAC, tasked with countering the trafficking of illicit drugs like fentanyl. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. With that, I want to thank the witnesses this morning for your compelling testimony, and we will enter now into the questioning period. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. You know, the purpose of this subcommittee is to look at illicit financing and the money laundering going on around the world. And this, obviously, this morning, this hearing is with regards to the fentanyl scourge that is affecting our country and our people, our citizens. And so the question is, how can we minimize that? How can we stop the financial flow to damage this industry? So, Mr. Gellner, I'd like to start with you because you start at the ground level with the local folks. What do you see as the way that the money is trafficked from the local dealer on the corner through to the cartels?
So most often it's trafficked in large bundles headed south towards the southwest border, right? So each of the cartels owns and operates at our southwest border crossings. And the major amount of violence coming out of Mexico is fights by the cartels over the control of those ports of entry into the United States. The flow of drugs and illegal immigration going north, and the flow of guns and money going south. With the advent of Chinese money launderers, however, they're able to orchestrate the movement of money into the hands of Chinese oligarchs who can then use those U.S. greenbacks to purchase land in the United States, real estate. They can place individuals into our higher learning centers and pay cash for that in U.S. greenbacks that they cannot get in China. They can do that at a cost savings to the Mexican drug cartels who were one time paying anywhere from 15 to 20% on the dollar to Colombian money launderers can now pay 1 to 2% to Chinese.
Thank you, Mr. Grellner. One of the things that we've seen, and then yesterday or day before in the Washington Times, I believe it is here, there was an article about border security as national security, and there's a comment made in here that unfortunately Mr. Lopez Obrador, who is the president of Mexico, has ceded estimated 35 to 45% of Mexican territory to cartel sovereignty. And rather than trying to work with us here in the United States, he's claiming that fentanyl is not produced in Mexico. And so my question is, we see that the border is porous, the drugs are coming across. How do we stop this flow of money going around to pay for all this? I want to ask Professor Realio first here, how do you affect the flow of this? You had a couple of comments about this. And then comment on ways to deter this, for instance, like seizing assets, sanctions. Are these some tools in our toolbox as Congress and we need to be using? And if so, how would you see that working out?
That's a great question. I was just in Mexico last week. I head to Guatemala on Monday, where, by the way, they've just done the first big illicit fentanyl bust, including the Mexican cartels, thanks to our colleagues at the DEA. So a little bit of a triumph there. In Mexico, we were doing very well in the past couple of years following the money. I personally have trained several hundreds of the analysts, as well as in the law enforcement and in the military, trying to follow and use what we call actionable financial intelligence. And more importantly, the real problem, and I hate to say it, is the lack of political will by our counterparts at the highest levels of government in Mexico. I've been working in Mexico for 10 years, and more importantly, going fairly regularly. When we can demonstrate that the problem is theirs as well as ours, which unfortunately we have not convinced President Lopez Obrador that this is the case. 2 weeks ago, he blamed us for the fentanyl crisis, and just a few days ago, he blamed our parenting as the cause of the consumption. We recognize we have to reduce demand, but the supply is definitely coming from them. What's interesting is that we're seeing now, in terms of new methods, the start of the use of cryptocurrencies, particularly by the Jalisco cartel. They're paying young Mexicans to open virtual wallets that are then used to upload the dollars on the US side and then download in pesos, which totally avoids US dollar controls.
Thank you for that. Mr. Cassera, I like your comments on that. You specialize in financial crime, illicit finance. Tell us what we can do. Are seizure of assets, is that a way to deter folks? Is that just going to shift things around the world? How do we disrupt this financial flow?
It's an excellent question and something that many of us have been struggling with for years. If you look at what I call the metrics that matter when it comes to money laundering enforcement, as far as arrests, successful prosecutions, convictions, and money assets that are actually forfeited to the government, as a colleague of mine, Raymond Baker, head of Global Financial Security, said, we are a decimal point away from total failure. If you compare what we're actually enforcing against the magnitude of the problem, it's very sad.
My time is up. I'm going to set a good example there, but thank you for that. I think that this is our challenge as a committee, is to see once where we can affect most effectively this flow of funds. With that, I will yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses. I'm going to try to get through 3 or 4 quickly, so I may ask you for abbreviated responses. First, starting with you, Ms. Peters, can you clarify for us the primary methods that drugs, particularly illicit fentanyl, are trafficked into this country, especially more surprising methods that don't get enough attention? You kind of highlighted it a little bit with your presentation. Is there any one thing you would ask us to take a look at?
I would ask you to take a look, as I said in my testimony, working with the Energy and Commerce Committee and your partners in the Senate at reforming Section 230 of the Communications Act to remove liability, to remove the liability shield that the tech platforms currently enjoy for hosting illicit content, even if they know it's there, even if they know it's causing harm. This is basically a huge subsidy to the tech industry and disincentive for them to remove this dangerous content because they can't be prosecuted. That would be the number one thing I'd say to protect people who are seeing this content everywhere online.
Thank you. Mr. Grellner, you also mentioned that it was by no accident, and I like that reference to that when you did car accidents. We also know if you look at the same age group of 18 to 49, and it was 100,000 deaths, only 58,000 with COVID-19. If we go back to the Vietnam War, same age group, 53,000. Can you explain this phenomena and what lessons we can learn to identify emerging drug use in the future to protect our communities? Give us one thing we can do with these alarming numbers that aren't by accident. Your words.
Thank you. You know, I think I was asked a question the other day that even caught me off guard, and the question was, why are they selling drugs to us that kill us? Because they want to kill us. DEA Laboratories just came out this week with information that 48 states have now seen fentanyl laced with a non-reactive agent, a tranquilizer used in veterinary sciences that will not react to naloxone. That means that if you overdose from this byproduct, we can't bring you back with a nasal naloxone. It won't work because we're also suppressing your breathing by using this veterinary tranquilizer. There's only one reason that they're selling this poison, and it is to destabilize the United States and to kill Americans. Look, I worked back in the 80s with Project Columbia, Project Nicaragua, when cocaine was coming into the United States as a party drug. I worked on 1,265 meth labs when meth lab components were all over the United States. It was about getting high, having a good time, partying. This is about killing people. And the sooner we understand that and realize that and fund the DEA and local and state task forces to go after it, the better off we'll be.
Thank you. Mr. Casera and Mr. M, specifically to the author, I've just had a chance to read one of your chapters that deals with fentanyl and trafficking. A lot of people are putting a lot of emphasis on the southern border as the primary point of fentanyl trafficking. We hear that a lot. Some of my readings suggest that it's inaccurate and it ignores the fact that 90% of fentanyl seizures occur at legal crossings. We've also heard about how it goes through the mail and PayPal. Just in my airport, and we're landlocked, in Ohio, there was enough to kill 171,000 people in my district when I flew to the district this week. What would be the number one thing, Mr. Casera and Mr. M, that you would say that this committee should do as experts in this field? Give us one thing.
I don't have access to tactical intelligence like I once did, so I'm not as current on the numbers as, for example, my colleague Don probably can give you a much better feel for that. If I could suggest one thing that our government should do?
Yes.
Control the border.
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member. The best way to effectively tackle this issue, since we're here in the Financial Services Committee on the topic of follow the money, use money as a leverage, use it as a weapon and a tool. That's what DEA has done since DEA was founded. And the way to do that is to strangle their ability to generate those funds. At the same time, in order to convince those governments, use trade as a
I'm
tool.
sorry, my time is up, but thank you for making it germane to the committee that it is about the money and not necessarily other things we're hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. With that, we recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. McHenry from North Carolina, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lukemeyer, and thank you for holding today's hearing. I think this is very important, and as I think we just can't lose sight of the fact that there are too many families have lost loved ones as a result of fentanyl poisoning, and this is very, very helpful. I reached out to sheriffs in my district to get a sense of what's happening in Western North Carolina. on this very issue of fentanyl, and what their deputies are seeing as they're out. And so I got a response from one of my sheriffs in Iredell County, Darren Campbell. He said since the beginning of this year, his deputies have saved the lives of 18 people using Narcan to counter the effects of fentanyl-laced narcotics. Okay, so fentanyl-laced narcotics. They didn't think that that's what they were getting was fentanyl. And you're shaking, yes, I see. So along those lines, I've got a letter for the record, Mr. Chair, without objection, I'd like to.
Without objection.
But this is a troubling and unfortunate trend. And so this hearing today is about following the money and the impact we can have on cutting off the flow of money, because that is the key ingredient that is necessary for the drug trade to actually flourish. So, Mr. Cassara, you know, the criminals that are pushing fentanyl, you know, we focus on what we see in the immediate, not who's providing it, what's on the backside of this thing and the international drug trade. So in your book, in CCP Incorporated, I'm not here to show your book, but apparently I am, you note that federal law enforcement tends to focus on participants in the product rather than the money. So how do we incentivize following the flow of money?
Once again, an excellent question. The criminals are motivated by profits, by proceeds of crime, not the criminal activity themselves, not the narcotics, not the product, but the proceeds of crime. In order to, we've talked about following the money for years, but we've never really actually done it. I've talked before about having to change the incentives for law enforcement to get them to refocus a little bit. I think there's two ways we need to do this. The first way is to look at this kind of at the macro level, because the concerned government agencies and departments need to kind of make this a priority in their strategic plans. They all have strategic plans, 5-year plans. Metrics need to be established, and perhaps the budgets could be contingent on making or meeting those metrics. At the micro level, if you will, Don knows better than I do today that law enforcement is statistics driven. Statistics drive everything from budgets to promotions. That's also why some of these bureaucracies kind of play games with the numbers and statistics. They go after the people and the products instead of the money because, quite frankly, it generates better statistics, and it's easier.
It's easier to go nab a person rather than to go get into the system of how this works. To that system question, Professor, how do we hold China accountable for the flow of fentanyl?
So we know in terms of taking a look at trade movements, they have to get paid. And we haven't really sanctioned, and more importantly on a broader piece, naming, shaming, and the asset forfeiture piece have been the most instrumental tools that we've had to go after the Chinese, but more importantly, we have to increase that activity. We've been doing it very well against the traditional Mexican cartels and the Colombian mafias that have been pushing cocaine for years. This is an area where we need to also raise, answering your question from before, to make the financial crime bear the same weight and penalties as if it were that you were trafficking a person, or they were looked upon as white collar, right? Financial crime has always been looked at as there's no victim. All of us are victims, and it's the oxygen that allows these armed groups to flourish, and they are killing our people.
In our sanctions regime, we are the power. This committee is the power behind our sanctions regime here in the United States. And we have a traditional role in sanctions. We name names here in the United States. We have a due process right for those that get on those lists, and we hold them accountable. And that is really key, part and parcel of our regime, is to actually be explicit about who we're holding accountable. But thank you for that encouragement. That tells us that we've got work that we need to do as a Congress. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. The lady from California, the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Peters, I'd like to thank you for your work on the Center on Illicit Networks and organized crime. You know, I do believe that when citizens take up issues to work on, that very important issues that are undermining the democracy, undermining our efforts to be safe, that we really should support them. And you can't do this work without money. Do you need funds?
I mean, I can tell you our organization functions on less money annually than a company like Facebook spends lobbying Congress every single week. So our organizations have almost no money. My friend Jaime Puerta, who's here, his organization Void, which is run by parents who've lost kids to the fentanyl crisis, have reached out to more than 40,000 American kids on their own dime. There's no government funding for this right now. We would like to see more funding for education to kids and also to parents so they understand this toxic mix of misinformation that's out there. A lot of kids who are buying pills online, they're not regular drug users. They actually know that street drugs are dangerous. They think they're buying a prescription Vicodin or Xanax, as happened with Daniel Puerta. He thought he was buying a pill to kind of relax him at the beginning of the pandemic when he was trapped in his room and feeling sad. We hear that story over and over and over from families. They didn't ever hear the word fentanyl until the EMTs arrived to try to revive their dead child. There's a toxic mix of disinformation going on. Kids think they're getting safe pills. Social media platforms are teeming with drug content, and they're not required to remove it or restrict it or put up warnings about it. And parents think that the poisoning or overdose crisis won't happen to them because their kids aren't drug users. We really need to work on this information, but also where this committee can help is to really investigate the payments that are coming through the tech platforms that the kids are using to buy these drugs. We've seen a great reduction in street drug markets. The drug commerce at the retail level and also at the wholesale level has really moved online, just like a lot of regular commerce. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When you talk about the kind of work that you're doing with young people, the kind of work that families are doing who have lost kids, I'm interested in also, in addition to what you're advising us right now that should be taken seriously, what we could be doing, I'm interested in what you may think about, or maybe you've already thought about it in terms of ads and other kinds of ways that you could try and educate young people and try and influence them and tell them the pitfalls of getting involved with drugs and it kills and all of that. And what worries me, and even though you may be approaching this in a little bit different way, we see that $8 billion was diverted, including $2.5 billion from DOD, the counter-drug program, $600 million from Treasury. Counter-trafficking includes sanctions, support, and for law enforcement. So we have money that we're spending, but you know, you keep coming back like you said, and I don't blame you. You're tired. You want to see some results. And so I want to see some of this money spent to help out in ways that maybe you thought about, but certainly you have not solicited, you have not, said the government, we can't do this without you, you're doing it. But wouldn't some of this money help you and these parents to do some of the education that these children need to have outside of, what they may hear about?
Ranking Member Waters, yes, not only do organizations like ours need money, but all the panelists have described different agencies of government that, we need to be throwing the kitchen sink at this problem. When I first testified about this, we were losing 60,000 Americans a year. This last year, the official numbers are over 108,000. It has nearly doubled in just 4 years. These are staggering numbers of people that are dying every single year. And there's not one single solution or silver bullet. There needs to be public education, extensive public education, and prevention programs, both for kids and for street youth, people who already have addiction issues. There need to be healthcare interventions to try to reach those people who already are struggling with substance abuse disorder. We need a lot more money, as Don M. and John Cassara has said, for DEA. I believe that our DOD also
Peters,
needs
your
to be
time's
involved.
Thank you very much. The chairman has been very generous, and thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. With that, we go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, who is the chairman of the Small Business Committee as well.
Thank you,
Recognized
Mr.
for 5
Chairman,
minutes.
and thank all of you for being here today. I'm from Texas, and I can tell you firsthand there's a crisis, as all of you know, happening at our southern border. I've been down there quite a bit. In February alone, Border Patrol encountered 154,000 illegal aliens, and so far we've not even seen the leadership that is needed from the Biden administration to get this situation under control, and a lot of you talked about that today. And I'm extremely concerned that as our border agents continue to be overwhelmed by this rush of migrants, it is making it easier for drug traffickers to slip through the cracks and bring dangerous fentanyl into our country. And I recently asked the Tarrant County Sheriff's Department, that's Fort Worth, in my district, how they had been impacted by fentanyl pouring across the border. They told me that in 2022, their office seized $35 million worth of drugs, which was 1,000% more than what they'd done, the $3 million of seized in 2020. And further proving that with weakened border policies and a lack of resources for patrol agents, more lethal counterfeit pills laced with fentanyl will flood our communities. So, Mr. Grellner, with your 30 years of narcotic enforcement experience, can you elaborate on how the crisis at the southern border is impacting law enforcement efforts to prevent fentanyl trafficking, and what types of policies are most burdensome for state and local law enforcement agencies?
Thank you, sir. Yes, the southwest border, when the full chairman was speaking earlier, he talked about fentanyl and everything. It is. Fentanyl's in methamphetamine, fentanyl's in cocaine, fentanyl's in 2C combinations. Fentanyl is in everything that is being brought across the southwest border. It's not just opioids with fentanyl in them or synthetic fentanyl. Fentanyl is being laced into every drug brought across the southwest border and then trafficked up through Texas, through your state, to Oklahoma, Kansas City, and then across the United States, Chicago, Atlanta, infecting the entire United States. One of the biggest things in going after the money that is inhibiting the state officers and local officers is state laws and federal laws not being in lockstep so that state officers can't impact bulk cash currency being trafficked across their own states because they're not allowed to stop it, they're not allowed to seize it, and they're not allowed to work with their federal partners from the DEA, the FBI, and other federal task forces in making sure that that money gets seized before it gets to where it needs to be. Okay. So working with our state partners, the federal government, and seizure laws to make sure that we are impacting bulk currency moving across the United States. Thank you, sir.
The opioid epidemic in the United States has devastated individual families and communities across the country. We see that today. Our prayers go out to all of you. Majority of fentanyl is mass-produced in Mexico by cartels using chemicals primarily imported from China. Now, these pills are being mixed with other counterfeit drugs and then are brought to the United States illegally. We've talked about that, and sold to unaware buyers, leading to deadly overdoses. To put this into context, drug-related overdose deaths have killed more U.S. citizens than terrorist attacks have from 1995 to 2019. Now, this is a direct evidence that the Chinese Communist Party is aiding cartels in the production of drugs that continues to take American lives. Yet there's been little action from the Biden administration to combat this lethal partnership between two hostile actors. So, Mr. M., could you explain the benefits of designating cartels as terrorist organizations, and how should we hold the Chinese accountable for aiding the synthetic opioid crisis?
Thank you for the question. Yes, sanctions are an effective tool. It's a primary tool that we've used for the past 30-some years since we designated the Cali cartel. Reaching down into their pockets, sanctioning, and preventing their ability to operate in the financial realm is the most effective way to go after these entities. However, in order to leverage these countries to support law enforcement efforts, you have to use the ability of the Treasury Department, Commerce Department, the State Department on trade tools. Use trade as a weapon, as an influencer, to convince these countries to start cracking down on what they're doing, what they're exporting to the United States, what they're pushing from the southern border. We have to use all tools, the whole of government necessary. DEA can't do this alone. We're here about following the money. Let's use money. And trade tools are one of the most effective tools to influence these governments to follow that money.
Thank you. I have small time left. Let me just ask Mr. Kassar a question. Can you expand on the scale of Chinese money laundering real quick, and how can the U.S. better combat this illicit financial network?
Thank you. In my statement, I said that if you total up all the specified unlawful activities, the largest categories of transnational crime, if you look at the numbers, it's about $2 trillion a year. If you look at the magnitude of international money laundering, it's about a year around the world, it's about $4 trillion. So it's imprecise, but in my estimation, China is responsible for about half the money laundered in the world if you look at individual.
Thank you. My time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Nickel, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'm encouraged by this hearing, and I think it's worth pointing out that one of the areas I'm very optimistic about in this Congress is getting bipartisan legislation done for immigration reform, and also include border security in that. So I'm hopeful that we can. This is something that we can accomplish in a bipartisan way. For our witnesses, thank you so much for being here. The focus on the southern border as the primary point of fentanyl trafficking, I think, is a little off the mark because it ignores that over 90% of fentanyl seizures occur at legal crossing points or interior vehicle checkpoints, not on migration routes or between checkpoints. While by no means should we minimize the issue of immigration, misstating the facts about what is being trafficked, where and by whom undermines our ability to address the cartel's criminal activities that have caused over 100,000 Americans to die in the last year that we have that data. It also draws attention away from the myriad of other methods that fentanyl, meth, and other drugs are trafficked into the U.S. The place I try to start on this is just the size of fentanyl, just the small amount of it, and that, for me, I think is an important place for the public to understand. Mr. Im, maybe you have some help with just the sheer size and the nature of it. I have this packet of sugar here that is 3.53 grams, and according to the DEA, just 2 milligrams of fentanyl is enough to cause an overdose. So this pack of sugar alone, could be enough for close to 1,700 overdose deaths. Is my math, is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you have some way to quantify the size of fentanyl that's as it comes in across the border? I mean, I think you hear the debate, you hear about this. My constituents certainly do, and you think this is like traditional drugs, large amounts of the material. But how do you talk about just the size of it?
Well, that's the challenge that we're facing right now. That's why we can't get a better grip on this. And again, it's not really about the drugs itself. It's about the network and the organizations that's actually producing it. It's about the chemicals that are being supplied out of China and India to the cartels. So it doesn't matter how much, because, as you stated, just that small amount can kill that many people. Then again, once it gets into the United States, they can take that small amount, adulterate it with other chemicals, and make more. And then all of a sudden, you've got not only an addicted population who want more of these drugs, and they'll keep using it, and then they'll ultimately end up perishing and dying.
Sure. Thank you. And you mentioned India, and that was sort of one of my follow-up questions. Certainly China is an area we need to be really concerned about. Are there other source countries that we need to be concerned about now, where perhaps we can take action to prevent their future or deeper involvement in this deadly drug production?
Yes, we do see now, or we have, or DEA has in the past, recently seen Chinese chemists moving into India to start or continuing expanding its precursor chemical production.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Fentanyl is illegally entering our country and killing over 100,000 of our citizens, particularly our young citizens. The amount of fentanyl seized since 2019 coming through Mexico has increased by 500% just in the last few years. Customs and Border Patrol estimates that it's the same level of increase that fentanyl getting through is equivalent. So Mexico has become a narco state, as sad as that is. Mexican cartels make as much as $50 to $60 billion a year from drug trafficking. We know the Mexican president does not take this crisis seriously. The question is, do we? Does the Biden administration and the Department of Homeland Security? I have a coroner in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, center of my district, Doc Moylan, gave a quote: "Our small county of 140,000 people have been battered by fentanyl deaths. We are consistently having close to or exceeding 100 deaths per year, and fentanyl is the leader on the list. And if not the leading cause, it's typically somewhere in the system. It is devastating our whole community. One thing that is overlooked is that the parents are dying of these drug poisonings, and grandparents are being left to raise their grandchildren. Something must be done. We are all border states." So I'm going to change my questioning around a little bit. And Mr. Casera, I'd just like to start with you. If you were the Secretary of Homeland Security, what would you do? What would you do first?
Two priorities. Number one, as we talked about, control the border. The second priority is emphasize following the money, take away assets. That will hurt the criminal organizations more than anything else you could do, is to take away their assets.
On a scale of 1 to 10, Mr. Im, how effectively are we doing that, securing the border in your view, and investigating the assets?
On a scale of 1 to 10, maybe a 5 or a 4.
All right, thank you. If you were Secretary of Homeland Security, what would you do to stop this situation or slow it, mitigate it?
Muster up the entire whole of government, find one central authority, create an actioning plan, and start going after all these cartels, influencing these governments with trade, because that's what's going to hold them to enforcing their own laws, because it's all about money, whether it's in legitimate commerce or illicit activities such as drug trafficking, money laundering, or human trafficking. It's all about the money.
Okay. Professor, same question to you if you were Homeland Security Secretary.
Most importantly, it's our human and technological resources. We actually have the wherewithal, we just don't have enough people. And this is a problem, and I don't know you realize that we actually have forward deployed Homeland Security agents. I was just in the Darien forests, in the jungle. Amazing work that our people are doing, but there's just not enough HSI agents down there. And that's actually where we're seeing what we call extra-continental. This is where they're intercepting. They caught Iranians recently, Somalis. This is what is of concern to us. This terror crime nexus that I've written about for the last 15 years is a true national security threat. So we have to beef up resources, and then more importantly, we got to go after the money going downrange. We're looking at Homeland Security takes a look at what's coming in, but we are still the #1 exporter, as John and I have worked on. Bulk cash smuggling continues because our consumers continue to buy drugs with hard dollars. There are all these innovative new ways of moving money through cyberspace, but hard cash is still...
Do you think we can get the Mexican government to cooperate with us, to work with us?
We've seen ways in the previous administration how the threat of sanctions, or more importantly, tariffs, at that time it was a little different because we were negotiating the renewal of NAFTA, were actually ways that we tied aid and carrots and sticks. And I think using sanctions also against China could be a very innovative way to hold both Mexicans and Chinese accountable, because their governments are acquiescing and allowing this to take place.
Right, thank you. Mr. Grenla, same question.
Certainly, I think one of the big things is getting the U.S. involved. It's striking to me this morning when I walked in, the number of people who are here from the media, not about 1 million dead Americans, but about whether or not we're going to do something with TikTok.
I've noticed that too.
That's one of the biggest problems that we have. People believe that those that are dying are just drug-addled addicts lying on our streets, and they're not. They're U.S. citizens.
Ms. Peters, I only allowed you 9 seconds, if you wouldn't mind.
It's okay. I actually would agree with what John Cassara said. I'd also like to refer to a comment that Chairman McHenry made. We need to change the incentive structure, and that's something this subcommittee has some control over. I want to see agencies get more money if they can put drug trafficking networks out of business, and they can take their money away instead of giving promotions and increased budgets for arrests and seizures.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now we recognize the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for leading this very important discussion, as well as the ranking member. This is a topic that is very important to my district in Colorado and also to me personally. Since I'm new and you all don't know my story, I have seen firsthand the failed policies at the federal level every step of the way, from the beginning of the opioid crisis, where doctors were provided incentives for overprescribing, to ultimately cutting people off of their prescription drugs without access to the treatment that they need. And then fentanyl starting to come into our supply chain, starting in 2014, hitting the coasts and then coming in to Colorado in 2016. When I was just 6 years old, my mom hurt her back. She went to the doctor and was sent home with bottles upon bottles of opioids, and that's where my childhood took a very different turn. She became wildly addicted to these prescription drugs, later was cut off of her access to those prescription drugs, and like so many people struggling with addiction, my mom always said that the thing that she feared most was withdrawal, not death. And she went to trying to fill her need with the disease that she was struggling with using heroin. And ultimately, fentanyl started coming into the supply chain in 2016, where my mom thought she was getting heroin, and unfortunately, that was laced with fentanyl, like so many people have experienced today. She started overdosing at a very high rate. That year, it was 20 times the costs at every level of government, trying to keep my mom alive while being churned in and out of the ER without anywhere to send her for treatment, begging for help. The state of Colorado and the federal government spent over $1 million just keeping her alive in the ER while she was begging for a place with nowhere to go. As a state legislator, I took that experience fighting to save my mom's life to change the system in Colorado and increase access to the critical services that these people need. And so when I think about how vulnerable we are as a country, because you all have talked about the stigma that exists, the barriers that we face, that these are, they're just addicts and we don't have to actually care about their deaths. The fact that the media is here covering TikTok instead of the thing that has killed more people in the United States than all of the world wars combined. I feel like I am screaming in an empty hall all the time, trying to bring attention to this issue. And so I just want to thank you for your work in focusing on this, and so excited to be a part of this committee. This time is going by way too quickly, but one of the things that we've seen in Colorado is just a lack of access to the dedicated treatment and support so that people actually get the health care that they need. But also, when we look at the distribution, you mentioned the social media companies. This is why kids are dying not knowing that they're actually taking fentanyl and dying from poisonings. And so we took the first step in Colorado for recommendations from the AG, but we need national effort here. They should be held accountable for knowingly distributing drugs across our communities. I also just want to recognize the parents who are in this room who have lost their children to fentanyl overdoses. I can't imagine your pain. I have a 3-year-old son, and when I think about growing up in the United States where he could make a bad decision one day and be at risk of dying, it is terrifying as a parent. I guess one of the big barriers that we have in Colorado is that we identified is also our state and local law enforcement are not working together. In fact, our law enforcement at the local level don't even communicate with each other. And a question that I have is, what do we need to do to help support that interaction get our state involved, get our local law enforcement working in tandem so that we're actually addressing the cartels and distribution at the state level. And then I think that we've talked in depth about what we need to do at the federal level around the DEA. Let's see here, I have to get sorry, I don't know. Mr. Grellner, can you talk about what we can do? Oh no, I'm already out of time.
I'll just say quickly, thank you for your thoughts, and say that I want you all to understand one thing, that fentanyl is not one drug. There are over 24 fentanyl concoctions that the DEA has already listed as List 1 chemicals. And Mr. Chairman, you talked about 50 to 100 times stronger in morphine equivalents. Carfentanil is 1,000 times stronger. So when you talk about milligrams, we're talking about micrograms.
Thank you. Thank you for your compelling story, Ms. Pedersen. Appreciate that. Next, we'll go to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the members for being here today. Particularly, I want to pay tribute to those who are the family of the fallen in this epidemic that has become the fentanyl crisis, not just in the United States, but around the world. Look, trafficking of fentanyl has had major consequences in my home state of Iowa, particularly in the 3rd District. Even the august New York Times has written about how bad fentanyl has gotten in the small town of Osceola, just 30 minutes south of Des Moines. A community of 5,000 people. This drug does not discriminate, and it is harming people in all walks of life. I've been to the southern border. I've worked to combat human trafficking that transports Chinese manufactured fentanyl around the world through our ports of entry, through the country of Mexico, and ends up in our communities. Like you, I have spent time with ride-alongs with my law enforcement and as a former military member flying operations along the southern border. Every community, every county, every city in my state is now a border community as a result of this. The Iowa Department of Public Health reports that over the last 2 years, they have seen a 34% increase in drug death overdose, with fentanyl implicated in 83% of those statewide. Among young Iowans, those 25 and under, drug overdose deaths have increased by 120% in the last 24 months alone. We only expect these numbers to increase once new data is available, and the longer that we allow China to be the primary source of both fentanyl and the funding that operates this machine, the more dangerous we are all put. And while this is a major problem, Congress needs to respond. So I'm thankful that this committee is helping us to follow the money on where this can best be directed for implication. So, Mr. Eam, I'd like to begin with you. As a special agent and with the U.S. Patriot Act was enacted after 9/11, which included Title III, the International Money Laundering Abatement and Anti-Terrorism Financing Act. This title includes requirements to improve the government's ability to detect, prevent, and investigate money laundering. The Secretary, with a range of options, can use this to target specific money laundering operations, including what we're seeing here with the distribution of fentanyl. These tools help take proper action for the U.S. financial system to address these specific threats. I'd like to ask you, sir, in your experience, is there sufficient evidence that Mexican banks are allowing cartels to set up accounts to hide and move the proceeds of fentanyl trafficking? And do you believe the Secretary of the Treasury should use special measures provided in Section 311 to impose information gathering, reporting, and record-keeping requirements on those financial institutions?
Yes, absolutely. Not only Mexican cartel owned bank accounts, but also those businesses that are also facilitating these cartels, the Chinese businessmen that are actually in Mexico and throughout South Central America that are using these accounts to leverage these parallel funds transfers that's continuing to fuel this entire crisis right now. Without the money, they can't continue producing these drugs. We need to cut the money off in the streets of the United States, and we're not doing as good of a job as we used to do, using the Patriot Act, using all the resources of the Treasury to cut off the ability for these financial institutions in Mexico, China, and elsewhere, whether a 311 sanction or an OFAC sanction. That's going to be one of the most effective ways of strangling their ability to continue this crisis.
Especially, I could not agree more. And the fact that we can have all the counter-drug programs here in the United States, until we cut off the funding supply of where this is coming from, we'll continue to see the challenges. One of my favorite members from history, Winston Churchill, highlights, those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it. While fentanyl is new, there are clearly some lessons learned from the past that we can bring forward. Would you be able to share with us, just from your perspective, how the DEA went after Pablo Escobar? Some of the success stories there are things that we can use here in going after the financing behind fentanyl, both in Mexico and coming from China.
Thank you for the question. That's a great question. The DEA in South America, specifically Colombia, at the time had the full support of the ambassador, the State Department, the intelligence community, and the military. They let DEA do their job. The Department of Justice allowed DEA to do their jobs, to go after these cartels, one person at a time. Every single person we were able to arrest, we were able to use their information to convince them to cooperate, to get to the next level, use that evidence to get to the highest pinnacles, identify their accountants and their lawyers that were propping them up, the entire organization, the Cali cartel as well. We cut them off after we identified their money flow streams from the United States to Colombia. Once we identified their money facilitators, cut them off from the cartel members, sanctioned the Cali cartel front businesses, the entire businesses. They own the so-called CVS of Colombia. We cut that off after OFAC and DEA helped sanction those companies. Now they had no funds.
I yield my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the recognized gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I'd like to yield the first minute of my time to Representative Pedersen, who has a story on a mission we should never forget.
The gentlelady from
Colorado
is recognized.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Representative Foster. Just a last point about some of the frustration that I feel every day being here in Washington is we haven't had any changes in our immigration laws. We have had increased asylum seekers from the instability in Central America and people who are coming to the border to flee violence. We know that most of these drugs are coming through the ports. How are we, when we think about what we're going to do to address this, it is actually looking at the data. We know that it is being distributed from Mexico. We've heard a lot about controlling the border. I guess I get frustrated with the rhetoric as if somehow this is happening to the United States because of a change of immigration policy, when in fact this is happening across the globe and started in 2014 to start seeping into our system, and then in 2016 in Colorado. So can we work together to address where this is actually coming in, around the ports, around making sure that we're increasing our, bringing new technology to the border, because as Representative Nickel held up, that little piece of sugar, the little packet of sugar, that's enough to kill, I think he said 17,000 people. That is, we need new technologies at the border. We need new technology investment at the ports. We also need additional screening in our mail system so we can address the supply side. And we also need to make sure that the United States is not so vulnerable by actually making sure that we are increasing access to treatment and recovery services and going after the social media companies, not going after, holding them accountable. So I just want to open it up to Mr. Cassara. I know you've talked a lot about controlling the border. Is this only happening in the United States? Were there changes in immigration policy you can point to, or is this just the new trend in unfortunately drug trafficking because this is a lot more potent and easy to distribute?
Thank you. It is not only just happening in the United States. There is an international scourge of what I call, say, trade fraud, for lack of a better definition. And I have been advocating for years now what I call trade transparency, both at the exporter and the importer, to combat things like trade-based money laundering and trade fraud in general. as part of your question, you're also talking about technology. For the first time today, we have the technology to make this happen. We have the technology to make trade transparency viable, but what we do not have is the political will to do so.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield my time back to Mr. Foster.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you. I'd like to get some quick number estimates on this. Mr. Grellner, you indicated that the markup was about a factor of 5,000. That is a $200 set of drug precursors coming from China eventually sells for $1 million, so a factor of 5,000. So is it correct to infer that approximately only one part in 5,000 of the profits from street drug sales in the U.S. are going to China?
No, because you also have to factor in the money laundering.
Right,
piece.
which is really a separate independent industry from the, but when we think of if we just shut down the precursor factories, the problem will go away. That's that I'm trying to get at. You know, back during 15 years ago, we spent a lot of money trying to shut down poppy production in Afghanistan. We spent billions of dollars, and at one point in a committee hearing, I asked the question, well, hadn't the Taliban kind of done this experiment? They shut down poppy production. It had negligible effect on the street value. And what we'll see, my suspicion, is that because this is such a small, the precursors are such a small fraction of the eventual purchase price, will just go from China to India, which I take it has already started, or other countries with a negligible impact. Is that a correct inference that there's a limited amount that we can expect from even shutting down China's production of precursors?
No, I think what we're looking at is what we've always done is shuffle the money around here in the United States. So we say, oh, we're going to focus on rehabilitation. Oh, we're going to focus on prevention. Oh, we're going to focus on enforcement. We have to have a three-legged stool. If you want the water glass to stand up on the stool, you have to fund all three legs: prevention, enforcement, and rehabilitation at the same levels, and quit taking the money back when we make strides forward.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank to all of you for being here today. Such an extremely important subject that has not been given the attention that it deserves and the American people are requiring that we give to it. Law enforcement agencies in towns and counties across the country, including in my own Georgia's 11th Congressional District, they're on the front lines of the war against the cartels and those that are financially supporting them. These agencies have repeatedly urged Congress to take action to help them better coordinate with their federal counterparts and stem the flow of money that fuels fentanyl epidemic in our country. I'd like to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, the testimony of the National Sheriff's Association, which calls on Congress to use every means available to combat the atrocities committed against the United States and its people by the cartels and their financiers.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Grellner, I've heard about some of the challenges law enforcement agencies in my home district face when dealing with complex drug trafficking cases and their local impact. Several of them that we've talked to have said that while regional federal law enforcement agents are helpful, the more involved Washington gets in the case, the more difficult it is to get the information they need. Basically, the higher up in the chain that they go, the more difficult it is to work with the agencies. Is this consistent with your experience working with federal law enforcement in the narcotics unit?
Not really. I will say this, that we fully funded the RISC network just after 9/11, and when we were fully funding the RISC network and the fusion centers, the interoperability between state, local, and federal law enforcement was at its peak in the United States, and we knew that that was germane to the intelligence community in the United States. We need to go back to funding the RISC network so that we have the ability to move information from state and locals to our federal partners, and our federal partners back to state and local agencies. And we need, as Mr. M said, to deputize more of our state and local officers to assist our federal counterparts. DEA is the smallest enforcement branch of the federal government at the current time, and they need help from the state and local narcotics officers who work on this every day.
Are we still utilizing or operating the fusion centers?
We are, but not to the extent, again, that we were just following 9/11 after we stood up the RISC network. It is harder and harder because of the funding sources that have been brought back and drawn back in the risk network to continue to work at the levels that we had worked at before.
One of the challenges that I know that our local law enforcement has faced in the past, my first term in Congress, I was in the Homeland Security Committee, and so I did a lot of work with the fusion centers and with our local law enforcement on issues such as this. One of the issues they had was, when it came to communication and working with agencies, was the lack of local officials having the proper security clearance to actually be engaged. Is that still an issue?
Normally, if the local officials are willing to work with the risk network, it's usually actually very easy to gain access as long as you have the proper credentials and work locally, again, with the federal government on that.
Okay. Because part of the problem was the time it took to actually get a security clearance. Then the issue or the emergency is over with by that point.
Yeah, my daughter works as an intelligence analyst for the DEA through our local St. Louis County Police Department, and she was able to get all of her clearances out of the way in just under 6 months.
So if I was to ask you what particular policy would be the most important for Congress to implement, would that be your answer, or do you have
The answer
something
is
else?
this. We've sat here this entire committee meeting and talked about, we know exactly what's going on. We can name the players, we can name the locations. We've got satellites 2.5 miles up in the air that can read a license plate number. We need the political will to put in place trade embargoes and agreements. We need to go after the financial institutions, and we know exactly where the poison is being made. This is not drug trafficking. This is an attack on the United States. And the minute that we understand that and we go at it as an attack on the United States, they are killing the people that are of fighting age in the United States if we are forced to go to war anytime in the future. And we need to understand that and go after them as if that is occurring right now. The time to act was yesterday.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'll make sure I understand what you're saying, is that the front line of this battle is really within the jurisdiction of this committee for sanctions and going after the financiers.
Yes, sir, it is.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Gonzalez, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I'd like to thank the panel for being here today. Clearly, from listening to you this morning, there seems to be no lack of knowledge and information, and there's a lot of certainty on what the problem is and how to address it. There clearly is just a lack of political will here in the United States and in Mexico, and that is our fault. And that's a lot more that needs to be done in Congress and through every administration, regardless what party's in power. This has been going on for way too long. And all I could address is issues that we can try to push here in this committee. And one of them that I'd like to talk about is the Cash Apps and PayPals and so much money. We catch bulk cash in my district on the border regularly. I think a lot more could be done. I think we could use better technology on our ports of entry going down. And something that we should talk about is over 90% of the fentanyl that comes into this country comes in through ports of entry. So I know there's a fallacy out there that migrants are carrying it on backpacks. That's just not true. It's coming in through ports of entry. It needs to be addressed aggressively at the ports. But what more can be done? I know these apps need to register at FinCEN. Some do, some don't. Are we gathering data through DEA when we bring in defendants? Are we, when they're being debriefed, are we getting information of how they're moving their money so we could address it further up and in Mexico and through our counterparts of FinCEN in Mexico? This might be a question for the professor. What are we doing in Mexico to pressure their version of FinCEN and our counterparts to actively cooperate with us and follow the money and stop those money supplies? And I can't agree more with Mr. M that we should be doing more through regular business. And I think sanctioning China and Mexico is certainly in order. But as I like to say, business is so damn good that we can't stop ourselves and we keep looking the other way. But I think hopefully now we're getting the attention that this issue deserves, and we start addressing it with real policy on the Hill that can have a certain impact.
So we've done a lot of work in the last 20 years, and it's great to be reunited with my teammates from post 9/11, right? John and Gretchen and Don. We're seeing the same problem. We're not following the money effectively. What we have been doing through technical assistance and foreign assistance is helping our partners help themselves. So when AMLO came to, the president of Mexico came to power, we already knew, because he's a very anti-American and very nationalistic posture, we anticipated we were going to have problems with cooperation. What we ended up focusing, and you can see in the national security strategy, inside for the first time, we have a chapter specifically on transnational organized crime, and within that chapter, there is specific reference to fentanyl and financial intelligence, which is bravo in terms of trying to understand the problem. And we were working with the AMLO team, because they ran and won on an anti-corruption platform. You use the same tools to follow the money for corruption as for all types of crime. So we were working pretty well with, at that time, the head of the FIU to train his staff to understand what to take a look at. We added a lot of the crypto, and more importantly, what was happening in the virtual world. Unfortunately, that person himself had been removed due to, let's say, questions of corruption. Quite ironic, yet not surprising in Mexico. And sadly, we've seen that type of training reduced.
Excuse me for interrupting. Has cooperation diminished under this administration?
Significantly, significantly. And what's sad, I've been working on this for 10 years. They won't even meet us, which is terrible. I was in Mexico last week. We couldn't get access to a lot of what I would call kind of diplomatic meetings that are just kind of one of those ones you check the box. But we're also seeing, we know where the laboratories are, we know where the routes are, and we have been sharing that intel and information with our counterparts for decades, actually, with the Mexicans. Unfortunately, there's no political will to go after figures such as we did with Chapo, and the DEA has tremendous challenges.
I agree with you completely. Just before my time runs out, I want to ask Mr. Kassar, are we doing enough when we're debriefing these defendants, DOJ is debriefing, getting information of how they're moving money around and getting it to other agencies that can use that information to stop the flow of resources?
I don't believe we are. Once again, it all comes down to the money, and sometimes we forget to ask about the money. We get so caught up in the product and the people that we forget to ask about the money. And truly, one thing I would like to emphasize we're talking about here, it all comes down to enforcement. All of these issues come down to enforcement. I think Don would agree with me, others as well. We really do have the tools, finally, after 30 years of anti-money laundering programs and processes, but what we're lacking are people on the streets conducting investigations.
Thank you. Yield.
Now I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Mrs. Dela Cruz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman and Ranking Member Beatty, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to the witnesses who are joining us. You know, to the parents here, I want to give my condolences. No parent should ever have to bury a child, and so my heart is truly with you. I'm a mother of 2 teenagers myself, and this is a fear. I am passionate about stopping the unprecedented amount of fentanyl that has been crossing our borders. I'm passionate about stopping the unprecedented amount of illegal immigrants who have crossed our borders. And to you, I say that I am with you. This stopping only truly comes when we stop the current administration, Biden's open border policy. You see, you can't sell the drug if it's not coming across here. And you know what, Ms. Peters? I'm angry too. I'm angry that you have to come here time after time. I'm frustrated by my colleagues across the aisle, some who live just right next door to me. I'm frustrated that they're acting like policy doesn't affect what we're seeing here with the unprecedented amount of fentanyl that's coming across. Policy is emboldening our cartels to use tools like social media to come across the ports of entry, between the ports of entry. And you want to know why? Because there's no consequence. There's no consequence. So what I am asking here is that even, I'm going to say that I agree with my colleague here, Ms. Pedersen. I agree that technology is one of the things that we can agree on that needs to happen on the border. But we can't ignore that policy and bad policy is what is causing these damages. And let me give you some of the statistics. And this comes from this administration. Just in Nueces County in South Texas, Nueces County, the Sheriff's Department and CBP, they got 3 gallons of fentanyl. They caught a coyote, a cartel member, bringing over 3 gallons of fentanyl. That would kill 5 million people. That's 2.5 times the size of Houston. Let me give you another statistic from the bad policy. The bad policy is we are allowing, right now, we have 1,221% increase in Chinese nationals crossing in the RGV sector. South Texas, that's just one of the 9 sectors. And I'm going to repeat that number, 1,221% increase. Do you know how much the cartels charge per person? $30,000 to $50,000 per Chinese that they cross over. The regular national, it's $3,000 to $5,000. Again, why is this? Due to bad policy. This drains our Border Patrol resources. It takes us 4 hours to process each Chinese national, draining our resources again. So yes, technology is one of the things that we need, but we need good policy that allows us to have legal immigration, not encourage illegal immigration. Mr. Casera, you're right. Criminals are motivated by money. And right here, I just gave you all the money. $30,000 to $50,000 per Chinese national, when regular nationals are only $3,000 to $5,000. Mr. Grellner, I'd like to ask you to explain how Congress could better coordinate between federal policy and local and state law enforcement.
Incentivize state and local law enforcement to help go after the money. Incentivize sheriffs to lock up those crossing the border and get back to paying those sheriffs a living wage to put those individuals in jail so that they can be deported back to their home countries. And look, this has been going on since the 1800s. Personally, I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, Green Party, I don't care. Just fix the problem. It's been going on for too long. Fix the problem. And policy is where it's at.
I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I begin, I'd like to request unanimous consent to insert 4 documents into the record. The first is a fact sheet from the American Foreign Policy Institute Center for Homeland Security and Immigration. The second is also from AFPI, highlighting the deadly consequences of fentanyl.
Without objection. Go ahead.
All 4? Thank you, ma'am. Over to Madam Pedersen, thank you for sharing your testimony and your story. Our hearts go out to you and your family for what you've been through, and we thank you. Overdose deaths in Tennessee have increased 200% in the last 5 years, most of those involving fentanyl. Referring to the statement from the Williamson County Sheriff's Department and Narcotics Officer Fan, just this March 6th of this year, a student at a local high school crushed up and took what they thought was a roxycodone, also known as an M30 or a blue. As it turns out, it was a counterfeit fentanyl tablet. From February 7th of this year to March 2nd, Narcotics Division, 26 different narcotics operations, in all 26 cases, the drugs tested positive for fentanyl substances. So as we go forward, the Chinese Communist Party is destroying American communities. Every small town in America is now a border town. They're inviting societal breakdown and tearing apart families. They're doing this intentionally and with the help of a Biden administration that can't bring itself to realize that our border is not secure. Anecdotally, this past month, roughly 300,000 illegals crossed into our country. Let's look at the numbers from this fiscal year. 2,300 pounds of fentanyl were seized by the CPB last month at the southwest border, which represents a 238% increase from February of 2022. If fentanyl seizures continue at their current rate, this fiscal year, we'll see the seizure of 26,400 pounds of fentanyl at the border, a figure that almost doubles the amount of fentanyl seized last year, fiscal year. The high demand for opioids in this country is being fueled by cartel access to our ports and our porous and open border. Our failure to secure our own sovereignty is creating a financial incentive for the Chinese Communist Party to kill Americans. Currently, 50% of Americans, according to Gallup, view China as our nation's greatest enemy. And it's about time that this administration acknowledge it. Professor Realio, has weaker border security improved the ability of Chinese suppliers and money runners to profit from illicit fentanyl trafficking?
So the Chinese purveyors are actually critical to any type of drug. And it's not just fentanyl, by the way. In order to produce, as you know, heroin and cocaine, which is also now laced with fentanyl, you've actually seen them as a critical enabler. Without the Chinese purveyors and without the actual chemical base, the compounds don't exist. And this is actually why I've advocated to take a look at how do we sanction the Chinese, whether they be companies or financiers who are aiding and abetting and using things like the drug kingpin list. We've used them in the past. And I think you all know that in China, if you are caught for drug trafficking, the penalty is death. But we haven't really seen the execution of drug traffickers. And as we also know, nothing happens in China without the explicit knowledge and acquiescence of the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party, sadly.
Well, Mr. M, you mentioned the Cali cartel and how they were targeted and designated as a threat to our country. When you look at the CCP, how they literally are profiting from the fentanyl precursors and the marketing thereof, just like the Cali cartel, if the CCP wasn't a state actor, would they be designated as a threat to our country? Mr. Cassara?
They could very well be designated as a ongoing criminal enterprise, in my opinion.
Mr. M?
Yes, we've identified literally hundreds of these chemical companies in China and throughout the provinces, in many ways subsidized by the provincial governors of those chemical companies. And we can help identify who those governors are, those bureaucrats are, that are help subsidize these companies that are actually conducting research and exporting these chemicals to the United States. And yes, if we can provide that evidence, we can sanction them, and we should sanction them.
Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Thank you. You know, as a mother and a grandmother, it pains me to see that our youth, the future leaders of this country, is being damaged the most by the fentanyl crisis. And according to HHS, the rates of illicit prescription pill use are now the highest among people ages 18 to 25. And to make matters worse, DEA says that about 4 out of 10 illicit pills contain lethal doses of fentanyl, which I know you all know that. Before I go on, I want to ask for unanimous consent to insert a statement for the record from local law enforcement, Orange County Sheriff Department, as well as an article from the Orange County Register. All right. Seeing no objection, it will be entered into record. You know, Orange County Sheriff Don Barnes' statement states that from 2021 to 2022, seizures of fentanyl had more than quadrupled to 450 pounds. And his department also seized more than 405,000 pills that are suspected of containing fentanyl in 2022, and that's 25 times the amount seized in 2021. So I want to ask the question to Mr. Cassara. You know, back in 2020, OFAC sanctioned Juan Cocoy, a member of the CCP and a leader of the 14K Triad. It's one of the largest Chinese organized criminal organizations around the world. In your statement, you mentioned that criminal activity has become part of the CCP's overall strategy to grow its power. So can you explain how trade-based money laundering works in practice? And from your experience, how does the CCP encourage this type of money laundering?
Thank you for the question. Trade-based money laundering, I believe, is the largest, most prevalent money laundering methodology around the world. It's also the least known, understood, and unenforced. I talk about it in more detail in my written statement. It's on pages 13 and 17. There are a variety of ways trade-based money laundering works, and there are a lot of different methodologies that are part of trade-based money laundering. For example, the black market peso exchange, underground financial systems, export incentive fraud, VAT fraud, all of this combined, as I said, make it probably the largest money laundering methodology in the world. There is much we can do to combat trade-based money laundering, but we have not yet taken this seriously by our government and other governments as well. I would also like to call out the Financial Action Task Force. In the world of anti-money laundering and counterterrorism finance, it is the FATF that makes things happen or not happen. I strongly urge the FATF to enact recommendation number 41 that specifically targets trade-based money laundering, and I urge our U.S. delegation to make sure that that happens. And I would also urge our U.S. delegation to call out China for being a money laundering center.
And so trade-based money laundering changed the advancements in technology and allowed Chinese and Mexican drug cartels to forge their businesses. So can you explain how that is possible?
Trade-based money laundering, think of it as value transfer. And we have had value transfer going back literally thousands of years, long before the advent of modern Western banking. This is wrapped up in, say, underground financial systems as well. For example, the Chinese flying money system that works very, very well. A lot of it has to do with, for example, hardworking immigrants wanting to send money back to their loved ones in China. We have no objection to any of that. Law enforcement certainly encourages hardworking immigrants to send their money back home. But what they've done is they're using a system developed back in the Tang Dynasty, if you will, back about 800, to transfer value in the form of trade goods.
I know I'm running out of time, but I do want to ask you to please walk through how Chinese professional money launderers are carrying out the mirror schemes and the role Chinese banking apps play to facilitate money laundering from the sale of illicit drugs. If you can quickly respond to that. And then.
We're talking about mirror accounts. So what happens is you've got bulk cash proceeds here in the United States, the proceeds of drugs. They need to get that back to China, okay? So you've got a Chinese broker working with a Chinese American businessman that's willing to cooperate. The businessman takes the proceeds of crime and from the broker, and using their cash-intensive business, places the proceeds of crime into the financial system. They do this for a commission, and the businessman transfers the equivalent amount of drug money through Chinese phone apps.
Mr. Cassara, I apologize. I asked the question and you are giving a great answer, but I'm going to ask you to submit your response in writing because I want to be respectful for other members who are here, and I already went over my time. So at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr. who is the chair of the Subcommittee on Financial Institutions, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you to Chairman Luchtemeier for holding this hearing. And I want to thank all of the witnesses for testifying today on such an important and timely issue. I've seen firsthand the devastating impact of the fentanyl crisis in my district and across the Commonwealth of Kentucky. The most recent drug overdose report from the Kentucky Office of Drug Control Policy reported that there was a 14.5% increase in overdose deaths in my home state. And according to cases autopsied by the Kentucky Office of the State Medical Examiner and toxicology reports submitted by Kentucky coroners, the rise in the death toll was driven largely by an increased use in fentanyl, which accounts for approximately 70% of all overdose deaths in my state. In Woodford County, Kentucky, in my district, a county with only 27,000 people, 9 individuals have been charged with trafficking fentanyl since 2016, and 6 of these individuals were charged with death of another individual. We need to not only arrest individuals such as those in Woodford County who traffic this potent, deadly drug, but also find and eliminate the source of production and financing. And when I talk to the narcotics officers in Kentucky, they are very unambiguous that this fentanyl is coming from our porous southern border, and the original source is China. And the Chinese are collaborating with the cartels, getting it through the trafficking channels up to Kentucky and killing our people. So let me just start with a question for Mr. Cassara and Mr. Grellner. In my district, officers who serve in the high-intensity drug trafficking areas, HIDTA, are on the front lines fighting against the cartels and their fentanyl trafficking activities. FinCEN at Treasury should be following the money in these areas to expose the relationships between the cartels and the illicit financing, which in turn should lead to cutting off the funding of illegal fentanyl trafficking. Can you all elaborate a little bit about how FinCEN, in fact, does partner with HIDTA officers to catch money launderers and expose illicit financing activities? And how could FinCEN do a better job providing, and Treasury generally, working with HIDTA and other narcotics officers to expose these illicit finance channels?
Approximately 22 million pieces of financial intelligence are filed every year with Treasury's FinCEN. About 4 to 5 million of those pieces of financial intelligence are suspicious activity reports. HIDTAs have access to this financial intelligence directly or indirectly through their members. To answer somebody else's question earlier, state and local law enforcement does have access to financial intelligence as well. One of the things that FinCEN, and I'm no longer within FinCEN, I used to serve there but no longer. FinCEN occasionally embedded a representative in the HIDTA task forces. I'm not quite sure if they do now. But by and large, we have intelligence. What we're lacking, again, my opinion, is people to use the financial intelligence to go out in the streets and make cases.
Okay, so you concur with that, Mr. Grellner, based on your experience? All of you do. And pardon me, because of lack of time, I'm gonna move to Mr. M on another question, because I think you've answered that. I see from your biography, Mr. M, that you co-developed the first ever OFAC SDN list sanctioning the California drug cartel in 1995. I have legislation, the Chinese Military and Surveillance Company Sanctions Act, that uses the OFAC SDN list to target the financing of military and surveillance companies that act counter to the national security of the United States. I'm interested to hear your experience and views on using OFAC sanctions, and discuss why the OFAC SDN list was the proper channel to sanction the cartel in 1995, and how this OFAC list could be used to target some of the producers of fentanyl production in China.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's most effective when they're most vulnerable. If they have legitimate institutions and businesses that rely upon the legitimate banking systems and so forth, and for trade purposes, and we are able to identify the evidence and information that they are committing illicit activities and crimes, sanctioning is the most effective way to disable their ability to use the legitimate financial institutions. And the Cali cartel businesses were most effective.
Are we sanctioning, is OFAC sanctioning Chinese companies that produce the component parts of fentanyl now?
Onesies, twosies. they should be doing a much more robust job. We've given them enough information and evidence on hundreds of these companies.
That is a critical piece of testimony and a takeaway for this committee and also for the Select Committee on China. I appreciate your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The first bill I introduced as a member of Congress was to permanently designate fentanyl analogs as a Schedule I drug. At the beginning of this Congress, I again introduced the Stopping Overdoses of Fentanyl Analogs Act, which shares the same acronym as the organization Saving Others for Archie. The Boudreaux family from Oconomowoc, Wisconsin in the 5th District lost their son Archie from a fentanyl overdose on May 15th, 2014. Since then, Lori has dedicated herself to raising awareness of the dangers of drug addiction, really not only in my part of the state, but throughout Wisconsin. And it's my hope that we can pass a permanent designation of fentanyl analogs to Schedule I this Congress, not only to honor Archie, obviously, and the countless other victims of fentanyl overdose throughout the years, but to further underscore the entire mechanism in which fentanyl is being trafficked throughout the state. And I know that many of you have deep expertise kind of in this area, but you know, we in Congress, I think, once again are seeing that the cartels, Sinaloa, Jalisco, they're just deeply involved and have relationships with China. And it's not only in fentanyl production, but also, as we sit here today, the money laundering issue. So, a question for Mr. M. And I know there'd be a little bit of a redundancy here because I know this question was asked before, but one of the problems when you talk to law enforcement is just the tracking. And, you know, if you can get the tracking down, then you can follow the money laundering and you can follow kind of, in particular, the increase in the encrypted communication apps. And the one that obviously most members of Congress are focused on is WeChat right now. So I just want you to comment kind of in general, other avenues or other ways that this money laundering might be happening outside of just kind of high tech as it exists right now.
Thank you for the question. They use both high-tech and traditional bulk currency movements. They rely on that. It's not just in the United States itself alone or North America. It's also in Europe. Anywhere where you have huge, large bulk currencies of drugs or illicit proceeds, they're going to rely upon these pools of funds. Why? Because there's a transfer of wealth that's taking place outside of China in the billions. And they need technologies such as these mobile platforms, such as communication platforms, such as WeChat and Gmail and Twitter and all these other type of communication apps and mobile payment apps. And these technologies, the companies that own these technologies are aware of what's taking place. The question is, how much of an effort are they really placing? How much investments and cost measures are they putting in there to increase their content moderation, to understand what the threats are? Most of the information is out there in the open. They can do much more. I'm not sure how much money they're really investing in moderating this content and threat. We've given them thousands of pages of documents, most of it or all of it just about on the social media or on the internet, on open source information, and they're still out there on their platforms. So compel them to police up their own activities. Law enforcement has a tough job of its own right now. Okay? We need the Justice Department. We need prosecutors to prosecute to the fullest. Why? Because if they're not prosecuting even a low-level distributor or dealer, and that person's not going to cooperate because he's not getting the full sentence, there's no incentive for that person to cooperate, for law enforcement to get to that next level and to the next level higher. It's a tool and effective way for us to identify the top leaders of not only the traffickers, but also the money brokers. Every time DEA or other law enforcement will seize a Chinese courier with $500,000, $1 million in cash, they'll just let him go. And there's no incentive for that person to cooperate, to give him that cash. Who gave him that cash?
And that's why I think the foundation, or certainly the simplest thing that Congress can do right now, is to once again move towards making fentanyl Schedule 1. If we can get to that place, I think it would give prosecutors one more tool that they need right now to fulfill kind of the goal of getting fentanyl off the streets. So I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to now recognize Mrs. Beatty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It gives me great pleasure to announce today that joining us, we have the national president, Ms. Jones, who is the president of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, with others here today, and they have a special interest in education, healthcare, and drug trafficking. Thank you. Also, I'd like to ask permission to enter into the record a statement that I did not get to make, and I did have time left, but 10 seconds in light of what Mr. M. and others have said about strangling the funding supply and what we should be doing. So I'd like to enter into the record that the President Biden's administration issued an executive order on imposing sanctions on foreign persons involved in global illicit drug trade, and also a bipartisan infrastructure plan that included billions of dollars in funding for border patrol operations, the hiring of additional agents, the technology to better defend space between the ports of entry, and lastly, the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020 and the Corporate Transparency Act. So we hear you, and the Biden administration also hears you. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mrs. Beatty. And I would like to also say a few words. Right across the hall, the CEO of TikTok is now testifying about the mental well-being of America's youth. And it has been reported that our sons and daughters purchase pills that are laced with Chinese-produced fentanyl from their own homes. Question to you, Ms. Peters. The pills purchased online are often cut with fentanyl to make them stronger, leading to poisoning of our youth and oftentimes death. And I know personally few youth from my own district, my high school, have died because of this. And drug dealers are purchasing the precursor chemicals from the CCP to make these pills, these fake pills. So from your point of view, are social media companies using all the tools at their disposal to prevent the sale of fentanyl pills to our children? And do you think AI could be implemented to take down drug sales more efficiently?
Ma'am, thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. They're absolutely not doing everything they could do. Many platforms say that they're building AI to look for drug-related content and remove it. In a lot of cases, they could use simple if code. The images I showed earlier had drug hashtags. You don't need special AI to look for that. If it says buy or sell oxycodone pills, delete it and report it to law enforcement. I mean, that's not complicated AI, and I'm not a tech person. There's a lot more these platforms could be doing. We have whistleblowers inside several big tech companies who have told us they've lost control of their platforms. They can't control it anymore because of the open way that they've been set up. It is the days for the tech industry to be allowed to self-regulate and to police their own systems are over. I don't know how many more Americans have to die before Congress realizes that and starts to change the laws governing cyberspace. I've known everyone on this panel except for Mr. Grellner for years now. We've all studied money laundering, transnational crime, criminal supply chains for years. I've switched my focus exclusively into social media because there is just so much of it going on our social media platforms. So this is really an urgent issue, and it's not just impacting drugs. It's involved in the spread of child pornography, human trafficking, child sex trafficking, the wildlife trade, antiquities, all sorts of fraud and scams. This is causing all sorts of devastation, and we, for some crazy reason, allow our tech platforms to regulate themselves, and consider everything that gets uploaded to be protected free speech. When there is a way, I believe that it would be relatively simple to define the difference between criminal conduct online and protected free speech. I'm not trying to get people, we're not trying to change the First Amendment. We're trying to define the difference between speech and conduct, and that's very possible.
Well
We ask
said.
you to get to work doing it, please. Thank you.
Well said. We couldn't have ended our hearing on that. I mean, that was a beautiful, final comments on this very important hearing that we had. So I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony today and all the members who asked great questions, and thank you for indulging us with your great responses. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for their response. And I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. With that, this hearing is now adjourned.